Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have another fantastic and incredible episode. Today but outside of the cognitive elite questions, we're going to go step outside a little bit of the current events and news. Almost do a kind of quasi IQ supplement today because I'm going to be talking a little bit about a book. I'm not going to thoroughly analyze it, but there's ideas from this book and things that the book covers that got me thinking about learning from the left or understanding the left more comprehensively and more realistically than I think a lot of people take advantage of. And the book is American Dreamers, How the Left Changed a Nation by Michael Kazin. And Michael Kazin is a Georgetown history professor. And the book, it's funny reading this because whenever you read right-wing history or analysis, they always say, oh, the left won everything, they're triumphant in everything, they just got everything they want. And in this book, it's a very pessimistic attitude saying that we lost everything, but we made a few little changes here and there, mainly in the culture, but we didn't accomplish what we set out to do, which is just funny reading this from the other side. And the other side has similar critiques of American society that a lot of the right has and how they perceive their ambitions and projects that they want to engage in, and how they've gone about changes in how they think. So I think this book's worth talking about with understanding the left and learning from the left, because really a lot of the rhetoric around the left, I've talked about this before with Trump's calling his enemies communists and other things. And also now that the communist term is coming back and it's like saying we're up against communists. And I've said a lot of times that this isn't quite accurate. It'd be better if we were actually against actual communists, because that would have a radicalizing effect on American society in general, normies and right-wingers alike. Because if you look at any of the type of radical rights that have taken power, say Franco in Spain, or even when we accomplished immigration restriction in the 20s, it was over a perceived threat from the far left. And right after World War I, we had a lot of left-wing terrorism. I think people who've read Mr. Grove's Substack can attest to this. He's talked about, the bombings, assassinations, attempted assassinations, a lot of the riots and other things. And people were afraid that there could be a Bolshevik revolution on American shores here. And that really made people change their opinions on things. And it made them want to restrict immigration because most of these left-wing radicals were just off the boat, and also made them support deportation and a lot of other things. So it's actually benefit to why we accomplished a lot of the things in America, and also prohibition, which even though some people want to say prohibition, I am not. I am pro-prohibition when it comes to drugs, but that's a different matter. That's outside the purview of this podcast. But when it comes to that, also came out over this fear of the far left and immigration restriction came out of that. And Franco obviously was fighting against a communist-backed revolution and our communist-backed government, and then staged a military coup against it. And so when you have that fear of a far left, it has a radicalizing effect on the right. And that was one of my arguments when I say when we're going to see a coming American Chauvinism, is that you would see an equally strong American nationalism in contrast to that. But today we don't have that. We have Biden. We have Chuck Schumer. We have these guys who are very much establishment liberals. And yes, they do pursue terrible policies. I mean, they are totally pro-open borders. They entertain reparations. They are, engaged in anti-white racism. They support DEI. They have a lot of insane policies that they back, but they are not communists. They do not want government control of the economy. They want a few more regulations and higher taxes, but they don't want a massive redistribution of wealth. They don't want government control of the economy. They don't even really want government management of the economy, which we've defeated. The right has defeated. I don't know if we would be saying that, but conservatives have. And that's worth keeping in mind with what we're up against, is that these aren't quite the flaming radicals that they are. This is almost center, well, it's not almost, it is a center-left establishment we're against, and their ideology is rooted in the American experience. I mean, the type of liberalism that they have is just a more radical version of what would have been seen in the liberalism of JFK and others. So that's something that you have to keep in mind when you're looking at who's in charge. So they're not really communists. I'm not like offended when somebody says, "Oh, this person's a communist," or "We are opposed to communists." And I am also 100% supportive of people exposing what the communists did. But at the same time, we are not up against communists. And communists, calling someone a communist doesn't have the same power as calling somebody a fascist or a Nazi. In our society, we're trained more to see those as very bad. When you call somebody a communist, it's almost akin to calling them a monarchist. It's like, is that even around anymore? Like, what is a communist? It's, vaguely bad or something, but they think it's something in the past, which is funny that we view fascist and Nazi as very present, even though they haven't been around in 80 years. But we view communists, which was around 30 years ago, still around in some parts of the world. I mean, China's, even though it's not quite the traditional communism and orthodox Marxism that it once was, there's still communist governments, but we view this and the public as something that's, anachronistic. It's something that's old-fashioned. It doesn't have the same power that it would have had in the 50s, 60s when you were calling somebody a communist. Then it meant something, and it was a very powerful effect because we were in the Cold War. We saw communism as the greatest evil, and it's something that we needed to root out wherever it took root. And now we don't really have communism to play. Even with the China stuff, it's the Chi-Coms and the communists, but there's still kind of an awareness that they're not really communists, which is accurate. There's something else at this point. But anyway, outside of that, I don't think it has... it speaks to the need that the right needs an existential apocalyptic enemy to advocate for its policies, and to get people on board with what we believe in, because we want to have a lot of radical and dramatic changes to American society. And in order to get the normies on board, they have to feel that the opposite side is a direct threat to their livelihood and to the direct threat to everything they've built up. It's like, they're going to take your property away. They're going to take your home away. They're going to take your family away. You need to have that type of image or that impression to get them on board with a radical right agenda. And right now, for a lot of the people, they don't like Biden. They view him as incompetent and not as Sleepy Joe. They're not as somebody that they're really impassioned to vote for. But they don't feel threatened by the Democrats. They just feel the Democrats are pursuing a lot of stupid policies, which is, one hand, is good, because I think that's inclined for these people to just either not show up in November, which is going to be good for Trump, or they vote for Trump, which is also good for Trump. And I think this is heading in Trump's way. But at the same time, these people maybe not going to be fully on board with a radical agenda because they don't believe that the other side presents this threat as this existential threat to themselves, and thus they are not inclined to fully endorse some of the changes we want. But we'll see. This could all change. And that's why I always say, there is a greater chance of and when I defined American Chauvinism as would be for massive economic, wealth redistribution, and it'd be fundamentally anti-white at its core. And think of a more hardline Bernie Sanders who's more openly anti-white and likely non-white himself. That's what we could face. I still think that you have the conditions for that. You just don't have a political leader there. People always talk about there's a crown lying in the gutter for someone on the right to pick up. Outside of that, I have a little bit of skepticism, somewhat of that. But for the left, there is absolutely a crown waiting in the gutter to pick up this anti-white Bernie Sanderism, this American Chauvinism, and to adopt that and to carry it forward. There is a huge element within the left, and even in the general public, that would be down with it for that. And that would be terrible if it actually came to power. But at the same time, if that was the choice for people, is like, It's either that or the radical right. That would have a much better impression, and we could call that communist. But there's, the concluding remark on that is that there's a need for this enemy to justify a lot of our rhetoric and our policies that we want to enact. And we don't really have that great threat at the moment. We have a lot of cynicism, I guess, or maybe that's not the right word. We have a lot of dissatisfaction with the current state of America. There is a lot of problems within this country, but it's hard to argue or articulate where the great enemy is from. And it's not quite from direct political causes. It's through these changes, social changes that we're having in this country. And it's hard to locate a sole culprit to push the blame on that would animate, the masses of American people to sign up for a radical right agenda. When you can blame for communists for that, or the Chi-Coms. And I think that's why, Bannon and Steve Bannon and a lot of others fixate on the Chi-Coms as the culprit for a lot of American problems, because it makes for a convenient enemy to advocate for their own position. And conservatism always needed a grand enemy. The whole reason that American conservatism as it exists today formed as a specifically against communism, as anti-communist. They wanted to be stridently anti-communist when they felt the liberals were not anti-communist enough. And that became the grand enemy. And ever since the Cold War, we've struggled to find an enemy. It's really just been libs, anti-libs, which has its plus and minuses, and that's been the case from the 90s, but it hasn't operated in quite the same way that anti-communism did. And also at the same time, when you want to just own the libs, it'll lead people to adopt lib positions like, oh, we're the real anti-racists. It's like, oh, the libs are not doing enough for blacks. We're going to do more for them. Or look, they're the real women haters. And sometimes it just turns into a way of like scoring talking points or scoring petty points against the other side to say like, oh, we dunked on them. They're defeated now because we said they're the real sexists. Doesn't really quite work that way. With all that in mind, now time to the book are learning lessons from them. And so as I was saying, Kazin in this book presents the left as losers, as they did not get what they wanted. Because something that we fail to understand is that, and this book amply demonstrates, is that the chief focus for the left has mostly been economics and economic issues. Now in the book, they also talk about women's right to vote and ending slavery and civil rights. But outside of that, with the labor question and with what socialists and communists were actually primarily motivated by, it was creating a more egalitarian society, and that would have come from economics. It would have been, ending economic inequality and redistributing wealth, having government control of property and government management of the property, and to varying levels of how much it was, but generally a government management of the economy and supporting measures which would redistribute wealth and have an economic transformation of this country that would be socialist. And so that was always a chief driver. It wasn't so much about, there was left-wing causes that deal with the social issues, and those became more prominent as time post-World War II. But the chief goal of these people was to have that type of economic revolution. And a lot of the far left will tell you this, like even DSA types in these Chapo cells, they would always say it's economics. Now, due to the fact that they've got a lot of crazy people who want to center it on trans rights or, radical women empowerment or, race stuff, their message gets changed. But and also a lot of these guys are primarily motivated by resentment towards whites, even if they are white or white presenting, we'll say that. But even that's like the case with like actual white guys, and they'll be, totally like anti-white and just wanting to embrace BLM. It's like it's a rebellion against their own background and family in much case. And they'll just be animated by this. But they have never gotten the economic control of this. And I had a comment last week in into an IQ supplement I think it was an IQ supplement, where the person was saying the conservatives have lost, or I think it was actually an article, conservatives have lost all social and economic issues since FDR, which social issues is another matter, but economic issues, actually the right's been winning since World War II. It's that the New Deal has been largely chipped away at. Now, we have a massively powerful government, which a lot of conservatives in the 1920s would be horrified by. But at the same time, the type of regulation and top-down management that a lot of the government was involved in through the New Deal era and in the immediate years after the post-war has been wiped away. We had a lot of deregulation under Reagan. We had a move, when they called neoliberalism, it's a type of economic system that's very different from New Deal liberalism. It's in thrall with business, and it's in thrall with entrepreneurship, and it's wanting people to, or rather it's wanting to take the government off of people's backs so they can make a lot of money. And, taxation has gone down, especially on the wealthiest from the New Deal era. And so it's been more of a unleashing the economy, and if you have a positive attitude towards it. So it's not quite on economic matters, on taxes, regulation, and just government relationship with the economy, the right has largely won since Reagan. Now, whether you consider that the right is another matter, but for what conservatives have advocated for, that was a major issue. So they won on that. And on social issues, gun rights and abortion, if you count that as social issues, they have made great strides for this, because gun rights, you have greater ability to conceal carry and own more firepower throughout most of this country than you would have 30 years ago. And so that is a major development. And now, unlike 50 years ago, states can outright ban abortion. That's something that couldn't have happened, but that's due to some of the developments. But it's largely these social and demographic changes that have happened. If you look at attitudes towards gays, if you look at the racial issue, yes, the right has largely been losing on those matters. And I think for a lot of the people who are on the internet, those matters, I guess you could call them cultural matters, or identity matters, identity issues is what I say, and those matter the most. That's something that's been lost. But the GOP hasn't been that focused on those issues, and I guess you could say that's why they lost on them, and so has the conservative movement. Outside of gay marriage and other things, but that's another matter. But getting back to the book, because we've been on a lot of diversions, and I think one thing learning from the book, it's primarily the reading about how labor and the groups that were primarily focused on economics worked, and how their struggles with getting into an American society, because a lot of the labor unions were started up by immigrants, whether, some of the first groups that were advocating for this economic egalitarianism, a lot of them were German immigrants. Then later on, it became Jewish and Italian immigrants, all along with a lot of German immigrants. And they were introducing kind of radical ideas that for the Anglo-Protestant majority, they hadn't been introduced to. Now, a lot of the people from Anglo-Protestant elites, WASP, in a similar way that happened in the late 60s, where a lot of these elite college students then decided that they're going to take up the cause of the Black Panthers, they would get into the same economic egalitarian agenda. But their constituency was largely, immigrants, and then later on it was added blacks and others, and there was a huge problem with some of the elite members and what they wanted to advocate for versus the people they're supposed to advocate for, because a lot of the immigrant laborers were very anti-black, but their advocates and the ones writing pamphlets in favor of them would have been fully on board with civil rights. And that was something at the time. But another problem that they had is organizing laborers, and there's still a lot of Native Americans, true Native Americans, non-American Indians, who were involved in the labor force. And they found that they had attitudes that precluded them or made them unlikely to support a socialist agenda, because they still believed in free enterprise. They were still strongly individualistic, and they were just not down for a collectivist model. America's strong individualism prevented the type of labor organizing they wanted, or the type of socialist activism they wanted. And here's a quote. This comes from Robert Schilling, a German immigrant who was involved in the unions, and he was saying about why it's so hard for socialists to gain a foothold in American working class, and this is late 19th century. Everything that smacks in the heart of a curtailment of personal or individual liberty is most obnoxious to Americans. They believe that every individual should be permitted to do what and how it pleases, as long as the rights and liberties of others are not injured or infringed upon. But this personal liberty must be surrendered and placed under the control of the state, under a government such as proposed by the social democracy. The problem, and end quote. The problem is that pretty much most Americans radically oppose them having to submit themselves to a larger collective identity. And this was being said in 1875. And you can see these arguments today, even from the right, about complaining about like, okay, we're trying to organize for a collective identity, whether it's, ethnic, racial, and or even with some people with religious identity. And you come up to what normal Americans are like, is that they truly do view themselves as individuals who are out to pursue their own happiness in any way they see fit. And it was very different at this time because, you still had a strong Anglo-Protestant culture that saw these guys as outsiders and wanted to force them to assimilate. And that's why we eventually had bills like the Immigration Restriction Acts and banning Chinese immigration, Chinese Exclusion Act, all these things that were designed to keep out outsiders. But now, with that type of identitarian feeling among the Native Americans in rapid decline, you now then welcome in everyone. And then, for a lot of white Americans, they'll see an Indian or Nigerian and be like, well, as long as he's working hard and paying taxes, he's just American as you and I. And there's this feeling that as long as it's all about the individual and that we're all together, and what makes us Americans is that we have a lack of a past, a lack of a heritage, and a lack of a collective identity outside a piece of paper that says we're citizens. And that we're all committed to the ideas that all men are created equal and that we want to uphold free market principles. And so a lot of that is there. And socialists clearly had problems with this because they were just, trying to have a collective. Their whole mindset was having, as it said, a government controlled, and ruled by the state that forces them to have a collective interest or a collectivization of society, which Americans strongly rejected. And that's why I didn't get very far. Even as the author notes, is that a lot of these leftists right after World War I or after the Bolshevik Revolution were like, we can do this here. But he was like noting it's like there was no appetite for it in American society because this feeling of individualism and support for free markets was too strong among the American public. And it was also being primarily advocated for by outsiders. Was not being represented among the Anglo-Protestant majority. Today, that might not be that much of an issue because we have so many new Americans, we'll call them new Americans, who are here, who have zero connection to the past or heritage or to our traditions, and they can feel very resentful that all these white people that they're taught in school who are terrible, evil people who are responsible for slavery and many other terrible things are making so much money, and why isn't it redistributed to us? I think you have more grounds for that type of socialism than you would have had in the 20s and 30s. But I mean, the Socialist Party was pretty big. They were, Eugene Debs was making a dent. They were winning seats in various cities. And they even had a few congressmen. Maybe it just might have been one congressman. Milwaukee was like a socialist hotbed. I mean, socialists were very much in power in that city. But it wasn't really much extended outside of that because they had other problems that are similar to the right, in that they had a moderate, pragmatic element that, wanted to, work and to figure out where Americans are. It wanted to appeal to American patriotism. It wanted to, run in elections. It wanted to avoid violence. And then you had a radical, idealistic image where people just decided that the people suck and they've got to launch a violent revolution now, even though they have no one on their side. And they were always combating this. And so a lot of the Milwaukee socialists who were winning seats and stuff had to combat their, their party loyalists and activists who are just like, this sucks. We don't want like you just running in races. We want revolution now. And they're like, We can't really get around to that. And so they were having to struggles with that. The Communist Party solved this a little bit because they had such uniform party discipline, which would make it unattractive to others. But, you know, the party line was being set in Moscow. The problem is the party line being set in Moscow didn't account for the conditions which they were under. And this presented a lot of problems for various communist parties in Europe, where they decided that the main problem wasn't fascist or the right, it was social democrats. And they had all their, they ensured that they wouldn't ally with them. Then when the Nazis took power in Germany, Soviets changed their mind and urged for popular fronts, which worked for a lot of these communists, and it did get them in power. I mean, it's why so many communists were in the New Deal government, is because they were told, like, hey, you can now work with the New Deal government. You can, you know, vote Roosevelt. We're not, you know, running our own candidates, or we're not really trying to upset that balance. And they got in and they got several jobs, and it's also where a lot of them were promoted by the New Deal's cultural projects. They were writing plays and songs and even writing movies. And this was having a cultural impact. Like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was written by communists. And so were other many popular movies are written by communist sympathizers. Dr. Seuss was not a Communist Party member, but he was a communist sympathizer and very much a man of the left. And his children's books became the most popular children's books. He actually says that Dr. Seuss's books are a reflection of the left's enduring cultural power. And now the funny thing is that conservatives rally behind defending Dr. Seuss books as part of a cultural war, which was, you know, they're books that ultimately teach an egalitarian message, and it's done by a communist sympathizer, and it's very much opposed to bigotry and tradition and the type of values that a lot of the right would stand up for. But due to, you know, the shallowness of the current cultural war, we're all, you know, demanding that they read Dr. Seuss books because there's like some school district that removes Dr. Seuss books or something. That's how successful the left is that Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Dr. Seuss and a lot of these other works that are products of the communists are now so much a part of the authentic American culture that conservatives take it as the traditional culture that they have to defend. And so that's a sign of the times, and maybe a bit about how they accomplish things through the culture and social transformations, but they didn't have the political and economic transformations they wanted. But with the communists, they eventually, you know, it didn't, you know, due to the fact that they're taking orders from Moscow and was seen as a foreign-controlled party, which they were, eventually doomed their cause. And also there wasn't a very inspiring vision when, you know, technically their leader in the Popular Front model was Roosevelt, not an actual communist. And this kind of doomed some of the idealism within that. And then the socialists declined, and most of the young left-wing intellectuals were joining the communists in the 30s and 40s. And then the government came down really hard on the communists and destroyed them. And eventually a lot of those people who were involved moved to the more moderate civil rights movement and normal labor organizing. But they had a lot of effect. I mean, they also, communists controlled the CIO, were heavily involved in organizing it, which was the second most powerful union in the country in the 30s and 40s, eventually merged with the AFL, which was the most powerful union in the country. You could argue it was the most powerful CIO when it was independent. But they were heavily involved in cultural production as well. But that's probably for more of a history of the American Communist Party that we can discuss. I talked a little bit about that in my first IQ supplement on McCarthyism, but it's worth, you know, that was 3 years ago, so it's worthy of a revisit and focusing on the American Socialist Party and the American Communist Party. The left pre 1950s would be a good IQ supplement. But moving on the conflict that they had, is that this conflict between pragmatic organizing versus idealistic rhetoric was constantly an issue. And this came to the fore with the student activists of the late 60s, which a lot of the right wants to say that these guys took over America, which they didn't. They eventually got like niche roles in academia, but they were not the ones at the driver's seat. They were kind of allowed in at the back of the bus after they apologized and forsook their violent past, and they're like, okay, you can stay at the back of the bus, but you're no longer going to advocate your radicalism that you did back in the late 60s. And anyway, in any case, the radicalism of the students helped elect Nixon both in 68 and 72, which is the opposite of having political influence. But they became so crazy that they became anti-American. They began flying, the North Vietnamese flag. They were a in total opposition towards everything that the American middle class cared about. And they turned themselves into an easy boogeyman for Nixon to run 2 successful presidential campaigns on, because it wasn't so much just the urban racial violence that was opposed campaigning against. He was also campaigning against the woke left of his time, which were the student activists, were the Students for Democratic Society and these types. And he's saying that the Democrats are on their side. These guys are represented by the Democrats. And he had a stronger case with McGovern in 72 and it ensured that they lost. While a lot of the more mainstream left that was focused on anti-war or further advancing civil rights were hamstrung by the radicals. And this even happened with the civil rights movement to an extent. Even though the civil rights movement was always based on provocation, the problems that emerged is that blacks started to riot and form Black Panthers and start shooting at police as time went on. And that obviously soured the American public on that message. And so I've seen right-wingers say that actually we need to be more violent and more extremist and radical because look at what happened with the late 60s. And in fact, those guys lost. They lost big time because their whole point was like this whole toppling of Americans and individualism, American free market, and the government and having a communist revolution. And even with the Black Panthers and that, all their objectives were not achieved. It was something quite different. It was something that was still within the parameters of New Deal liberalism that succeeded. The only difference is that now we had even less of a government-managed economy post-70s than definitely what the radical left wanted. And so some of the cultural changes that have happened have just been more due to American hyper-individualism than the efforts and the appeals to that fundamental belief than the efforts of the far left. I mean, even when you look at like gay marriage stuff, like those guys aren't communists. Those guys are full on board capitalists. They probably like low taxes and all those stuff, but they accomplished this by appealing to the middle, the center, which is just live and let live. Is like, as long as you're not bothering me, I don't care. And that's how they have been able to accomplish some of these radical changes, rather than the far left preference of just enforcing this stuff and totally dismantling even how middle America lives, which some of these changes have had that effect, but it's very much in a different vision than what the Weathermen were going for in the late 60s and early 70s. And the last chapter in the book is pretty grim. It's like, the left, most of the idealism is gone. It even says that they're leftists without a movement. It's like Howard Zinn is more popular. He was also saying like the opposition to the World Trade, the riots in Seattle, the WTO was positive, but following riots never got unions involved. He also notes that union membership has radically declined. And the book came out before Occupy Wall Street, which it's probably good that it didn't, because it'd be like, wow, the left is coming back with Occupy Wall Street. And it's before Bernie Sanders as well. So he could have been like, wow, the left is coming back in a big way. But if it was written in like 2024, it'd be like, wow, the left is not around anymore. We're instead stuck with Biden. So it just depends. I think it came out like 2010, 2011. Right before Occupy Wall Street, because it talks about Obama's election. And it notes that there's like a mainstream effect of it, because Pete Seeger, who is a communist-linked folk singer, went to Obama's inauguration and sang, Woody Guthrie songs with him that had a powerful left-wing message, but it's in the context of Obama's inauguration, and Obama isn't a socialist. So it's in some ways that these guys are more revered and more popular, but they have their ideas and their actual ideas that they want enacted are further away from actually being done. And I think that's like his concluding message. So it's interesting to get this perspective from a leftist of how they view these things, because everything we have from the right is like the left has just had one victory after the other, and there's been defeat after defeat for conservatives, and everything is hopeless, and the weathermen now control American society, which from the left. And also this guy had connections with the weathermen. He was involved in the Students for Democratic Society in the leadership when back in the late 60s, and he was even in some left-wing commune, I think in Seattle or Portland, like in the early 70s. So he's intimately, involved in this stuff. But he has like a very negative opinion about what they accomplished, or an attitude towards it. But I wouldn't say quite negative, because he does feel that, like through Dr. Seuss and Woody Guthrie and a lot of these other popular left-wing artists, that there's been the spread of these left-wing ideas disseminated by popular culture. So some things to learn from this book is, I think when we're thinking about what has won, it is this American idea of individualism, shorn completely of any identity components or components connected to the historic American nation, that has won. If you look at the type of individualism that was popular in the antebellum era or the 19th century, it was strongly tied to that Anglo-Protestant identity. It was an expression of the core population of America. Ever since World War II, it's been shorn of that ethnic component, and now it's just a free-floating, atomized individualism that is victorious, rather than so much of the far left, which the far left, even so some of these 60s radicals were appealing to that individualism. I noted that in my IQ supplement on neoliberalism as the concept. It was a book written by Gary Gersel, who noted that a lot of those 60s radicals were also wanting to have appeals to unlimited freedom and these concepts also within a collectivist society, which obviously didn't work. But that's really what's been achieved. And if you look at all these issues that have been advanced, a lot of those have been appealing to that hyper-individualism. The only thing that's kind of counteracted that is more the Black Lives Matter and the racial stuff, which is appealed to an egalitarianism that is much stronger than ever before. But the egalitarianism has little impact on economic issues, because America stresses the economy above all else. I mean, the economy is important to all countries, but with America, commerce is king. That is the primary concern, and anything that gets in the way of that, we will oppose. Now, some things do limit its development. There are hindrances, slight hindrances put on it, whether it's affirmative action or some of these regulations. But with affirmative action, we believe it's good for our economy. We always say this is how we're going to advance in a 21st century economy. They truly believe diversity is a key ingredient to commerce, rather than something that's hindering it. So that's one thing that has to be kept in mind with egalitarianism, is that it's really only in social and cultural attitudes that it's impacts. It doesn't have, and for the left of the early 20th century and late 19th century, they wanted it to primarily have an impact on economics, and it hasn't. So when you want to say that something triumphed, it's more that this attitudes that we had at the founding, with both a strong emphasis on commerce as like the driver of the nation and the most important thing to a nation, and the individual's pursuit of happiness and the celebration of the individual who can leave behind the past and traditions of Europe and come to the new world and become a new man. Those have now gained credence, or become even more powerful, but they've been the ethnic component, the Anglo-Protestant identity with it, that were fundamental to it. Those have been sheared off in favor of what we have today. And there are other interesting lessons. Even though Kazin was himself involved in the radical left and living in a commune, he realizes this was not appealing to majority of people. He does write, and he is still a radical leftist, but he's at least has awareness of what the world's like, and he understands that the left, a lot of the radicalism was self-defeating, is that if they're burning American flags and doing these provocations, whether it's even the women's rights of throwing bras in a trash can or something, that this had, rather than a powerful impact on society of changing their views, it instead would create a backlash towards these ideas. A little bit different today, because if you look at with the BLM riots, the 2/3 of America then endorsed BLM during the riots, but that was just a weird moment. And now, over time, a majority of Americans no longer support Black Lives Matter. It's now a majority has a negative opinion of Black Lives Matter. But at that time, there wasn't the backlash effect. But for most of our history, modern history, when they would do these provocative acts, there's generally a strong negative reaction towards that, a reception towards that. So the book, he celebrates the idealism, but he notices that some of the time the idealism overtook pragmatic concerns, and that the left should have been opposed to violence. For the most part, is that this country was not primed for a revolution at any point that these guys were trying to attempt revolution, and it was ultimately resulted in the left being suppressed, especially in the 1920s, and that it noted that it has to try to reach the middle American masses, but there was almost limits to it because the type of economic vision they wanted was unappealing to them. Because even with these Americans, and he notes this in his book, is that even a lot of working class Americans, they all thought if they work hard enough and play their cards right, that they could achieve the American dream, and a lot of them did. And it was hard for them to accept a left-wing vision and message because they felt that would impact and block their path to achieving the American dream. So rather than saying the left won on these issues, I think it's to say the center won, but the center is far worse than what it was in the 1950s. And in many cases, the center has always sort of won in America. And the center is simply focused on the economy and commerce, thinks that we can achieve these rights and make a society a little bit more egalitarian and equal, but its main goals are individualism and developing the economy. And that didn't run counter to America's fundamental character through most of its history, but it has had that effect in the post-war eras, that it has challenged that fundamental character and transformed it to being open to the entire world, which it wasn't pre-World War II. There were people who were attached or had sympathies with the radical left who were responsible for these changes, like Martin Luther King and people like that. But if you look at the people who were mainly responsible, like Truman, FDR, LBJ, even with Reagan, to some of the, even though that was more unintentional with him, H.W. Bush, and a lot of the lawmakers who passed the 1990 Immigration Act and the 1991 expansion of the Civil Rights Act, all these things, it was done by more the center, and it wasn't being influenced by members of the far left or the Frankfurt School. It was just them at this time feeling like, oh, well, I guess this is really how we live up to our American values, and it's also good for business. And saying something is good for business has been more detrimental to America than anything else. I mean, this is how they passed the civil rights regime, because they're like, well, these ideas and policies, they get in the way of business. So we need to get rid of them so business can flourish. And also it's outrageous to our fundamental values of Americans. And that's really been the problem, is that the center has gotten far worse than more that the far left took over. But it makes for a much better narrative. And I understand that when I'm not fully opposed to it, but this isn't so much of a channel for building a party platform or propaganda. It's just to offer my own observations on these things and to offer what I view as the truth. But so it's, if you want to say the communists took power or whatever, it's fine. But I don't think it has quite the resonance as we want. Other lessons to learn is I think this book does offer another side to when you want to adopt radical politics and how it may be perceived and how it may go down with the rest of the public. Because I've written columns about this. I wrote something recently like American public isn't ready for a revolution and all these things. And it's worth noting this stuff. Some people get mad when I point this stuff out. But you can look at what the left, what happened to them. And they had a clear constituency that was at least ready for radicalism, but it wasn't enough to get them over the line. And also they alienated too many people with their radical agenda, as it ran counter to a lot of what America is about. So you have to always keep this in mind. And even when America had an impoverished proletariat there that was willing to bomb and assassinate people and riot all the time and go on these labor strikes that resulted in a ton of violence, they couldn't have a revolution then. And a lot of guys on our side, when we view every protest in the street as federally organized and organized by the feds, I don't think you really have quite the momentum from the right for this type of politics and for that type of revolutionary urge. But I think one thing, both for the radical right and radical left, is there are more opportunities now than ever before for our country because fewer people believe in the consensus. The consensus, even though we do have unprecedented levels of prosperity and tons of entertainment and gimmicks to keep us occupied, is that people feel a larger sense of dissatisfaction with life. And that there are fewer people with a real commitment to the traditions and values of American society than there were 50, 60 years ago. And there's a lot of just new element in society that, raised up on anti-white racism and viewing that all of American history is bad and evil. And they're more inclined to support, the type of anti-white socialism I outlined in my American Chauvinism piece. At the same time, I think with the right is that, it's a very different country that we're wanting than what we would have been defending against the communists in the 20s and the 50s and 60s. You had still a traditional Anglo-Protestant America or a traditional white America then. You don't have that now. And there's somebody who quotes in this book, Richard Rorty, famous left-wing philosopher who made this I think that this can apply to the right. And Rorty says, you have to describe the country in terms of what you passionately hope it will become, as well in terms of what you know it to be now. You have to be loyal to a dream country rather than one to which you wake up than the one to which you wake up every morning. And I think that's even more true for the right than it is the left today, is that country we're trying to preserve, or to really, or better term, to realize, isn't the one we're waking up in. But we still have to have that as a unifying principle to keep us together and to work against the left's version of America, which would be even worse and would be just the end of everything that we would want to achieve. So in Rorty's words, we have to understand what America's like now and then dream of a better America, and the ideal America we have is what we're loyal towards. And I think that's very good advice for the right. And so that's what I'm concluding with the main topic. Now we're going to move on to the cognitive elite questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the cognitive elite option at Highly Respected Substack. And that's at highly-respected.com. And make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements while you're there. So we'll start off with K-Max. He's got 2 questions today. He says, Scott, with VDARE being taken down by Letitia James and her lawfare, is Jared Taylor's American Renaissance also at risk? How do you compare the 2 organizations? Do all organizations on the dissident right have to fear the VDARE treatment, or was VDARE in a unique situation? Well, the answer to that, it's both, because VDARE wasn't a unique situation because they had registered in New York, and thus they were subject to the whims of their radical AG in the same way that it was with NRA, with the unique laws there. And her lawfare was that they weren't charged with a crime, they were just being investigated, and that they had to turn over a lot of documents for discovery as a part of this investigation. And there was a battle over whether they would have to, retract the names that they wanted to give, because for obvious reasons, the donors and writers for VDARE don't want themselves potentially revealed by the Attorney General. And so there was fights over that, and they had to comply with a lot of this stuff. And so it was costing them a ton of money just to deal with this legal investigation, even though they hadn't been charged with a crime yet. It was the same thing that was happening with NRA. And they felt that it was, with this in mind, that it's better just to shut down VDARE because they can't afford this legal battle anymore. And AR is not registered or wherever they're, proper legal in New York. I don't know if other left-wing AGs would do that with groups that are registered in particular, blue states. If something was like registered in Massachusetts, if it was some like considered hate group, they would definitely try to do this. So with other groups, they're not at the same risk of Letitia James unless they are based in New York, or they were previously based in New York. But at the same time, others could take example of this. And this could be applied to many other groups. And the federal government, maybe if there's a radical AG there, that they could just like, oh, well, I'm going to do this on federal grounds and, launch an investigation in some group to see if there's potential financial misdealing here, or whatever reasons that they want to concoct. I mean, the real reason is because of VDARE's stance on immigration that they went after him. So it's definitely something that you have to be worried about. It's definitely disturbing what Letitia James is doing. It's what she's done to the NRA and to Donald Trump. And I argued that, in a column before, that she has a good opportunity to run in 2028 as a strong contender. Well, the only thing that might prevent her is her age and her lack of charisma. But her resume would look very good to Democrats. And if she became president, that would, I said this before, I'd probably have to leave the country. So I would not expect a lot of other groups to face this situation in the very near future, but it could happen because it sets a precedent. And Letitia James is essentially saying like, hey, if there's some group you don't like in your state and, you want to punish them, you can just launch an investigation and say, oh, well, these are the grounds. We want to make sure that everything's, 100% with you, and we're going to make sure you have to spend a lot of money on legal fees in order to deal with this. And so it is setting a precedent there. So that'd be my question, or my answer to that. His second question, to confirm if the U.S. split along the Civil War lines now as it would have the South won the Civil War, do you feel the South would now be... Oh, okay. He's saying if the South essentially had won the Civil War. Do you feel that the South would now be a second or third world country? Does the South, in your view, just not have the resources to run on its own as an economy? The human capital. What if the split were just red states versus blue states? The blue states have Wall Street and Silicon Valley, and thus too much of the tax revenue for the red states to survive on their own. Trying to think... Okay, actually, what he's saying is weirdly worded, but he's saying if we had split off now along Civil War lines, do you think the South would be a second or third world country? It wouldn't be quite a second world or a third world country, but it would be poorer. I don't know if it would be the South either, because, it's mainly, the Mountain West and the Great Plains that would include a lot of it. And also, I don't know if Virginia, would go along with the rest of the South either. And also, well, Maryland didn't go along with the South in the Confederacy, but there's a lot of states that were supposed to go along with the South that would definitely not go this time. So it would just be a poorer country. Whether they're saying it's second or third world, it would not have the capacity, because we would have all these like terrain and resources and networks that we would just give up in that split. There'd be arguments over who's got control of the Mississippi River and other, international and other communications and travel lines and internal lines within the country. They'd be cut off from other parts of the country. A lot of people would then immigrate to the blue states, depending on how the economy is up. And also some of these, when they're outlining the red state versus blue state, is a lot of the blue states get the majority of the coastline. It's like the red state America is left with little of the coastline and little of the financial centers. as well. So it would definitely be a poorer country. It would not be fully third world. It'd have a less of the elite human capital. I don't like the term because it's like really pompous. But for lack of a better term, I mean, most of the people who are engaged in the in the top professions in our society would want to stay in blue state America. Blue state America would have most of the coastline and the ports, and red state America would have. There would also be problems with agricultural production that would get disrupted. We've built this whole country and an economy on having this continent to ourselves, and then we split it along political lines, and people are moving place to place. It would make America fundamentally, red state America would be fundamentally militarily weaker, would exert less presence on a global stage, and it would be poorer due to the fact that a lot of how we've built up our economy along this having this continental landmass is no longer there, and we're having to negotiate and now have these new difficulties in transport and other things that are fundamental to the economy. And then a lot of the elite human capital leaves to blue state America. Yeah, it would not be well off. Blue state America would also be poorer as well. And I think that's why you would just I think Silicon Valley would probably stay in blue state America, and we would both be trying to import as many Indians to work in the tech sectors, our competing tech sectors, but they would probably be both inferior tech sectors than what we have today. So I think due to the economic reasons and a lot of other reasons, you would just not see that split, because I think there is an awareness that would just make everyone poorer than what they are now, and for a goal that people really can't articulate. It's like we need to get away from wokeness, but we're still going to have tons of immigrants in red state America. So that's my answers to K-Max. Kingslander he's got one for his next main podcast. Or he's like this, he's got one for the mailbag, and he's got one for the main podcast. He says, do you think the State Department will ever actually pivot to China in the modern West? We saw this in the Trump era somewhat, but it always came in the form of banal civic nationalism platitudes in the they hate us for our freedom sense. And post-Floyd America, I have a hard time seeing the State Department trying to gin up any form of overt antagonism towards China, since the modern American elite is afraid of any sort of perceived racism against non-whites. Will a pivot to China strategy come in the form of tariffs against China due to Islamophobia and suppressing gay rights? There's already that pivot to China, even under Biden. The Biden has kept the pivot to China. It is all that they hate us for our freedom, and look at what they're doing to the Uyghurs, and that they don't respect gay rights enough. And so it's all the same stuff that we had under Trump. I mean, the foreign policy establishment has already made their pivot to China. And both sides are very anti-China, and then will make their appeals on foreign policy on how we have to isolate China and we have to contain China. So the State Department definitely has. I mean, Jake Sullivan, not State Department, but he's a national security advisor for Biden, and he's the most important person when it comes to shaping the Biden foreign policy. And he had a big speech about how we need to effectively decouple from China. And we need to have a quasi-economic nationalist vision for the country in order to combat China. And this is a guy who's very much a part of the foreign policy blob and foreign policy establishment, and is setting the agenda for Biden. And this is his message. So we've already had a pivot to China. It's just that it's not as working on the culture as much as the antagonism towards the Soviets did. Because and also there's other issues as well, is that our economy and our economic elites are very pro-China. And it's hard to have the type of Cold War that the foreign policy establishment wants with those conditions. And there's a cultural factor, is that, there is a perception that like it's too racist to be anti-China. And that's why they prefer Russia, because it's a white country. It's much easier to make them the bad guy because you don't have to worry about being racist towards Russians. Actually, Russophobia is an encouraged bigotry in our society. But Russia is clearly not the type of global threat to us that China is. So it's the foreign policy establishment has made that pivot, but the culture we have has not made the type of hard pivot towards anti-China, or anti-CCP stuff doesn't have the type of power that anti-Soviet rhetoric and anti-communist rhetoric had during the Cold War. That could change, but they wish they could have that. The establishment and the elites wish they could have that, but they're struggling to achieve that. So that is my answer to Mr. Kingslander. And we have, I'm trying to debate which are going to the mailbag and not. We have, Dollar Bill had 3 questions, and one or 2 of them I actually would say I would answer for the main episode. And he said he's got 3 questions. His other question will be for the mailbag. The first question is it cowardly to block somebody on X you've never interacted with? I've been tempted to do this several times with people with pure strain cold tweets showing up in my timeline, but I've heard others call this a bitch move. Yeah, I think it is. I don't know if cowardly. I just think it's stupid. I hate people who like mass block. There's tons of people I've never interacted with, primarily on the right, and like I'm blocked by them. And I only block people who spam me or just get really annoyed. Like I had this dedicated audience of Greer haters who would come in my replies, and they had the stupidest stuff. And they were doing this for years and years. And then like one time last year, I was like, I'm tired of these guys filling up my mentions, so I just blocked them. But I blocked very few people. There's some of the Greer haters that are still there in my mentions. I find them either remarkably entertaining, like the guy who's still mad at me for disagreeing with him about heavy metal music in the Radix comments section in 2014. That guy I thought about blocking, but I felt that guy delivers such great content that I can't block him. I cannot do that. There's a few others, but I don't really block people. And doing that, whenever I see this, is like this, that is a bitch move. When I just see some random guy who's like I've never interacted with, and it's likely this guy got really butthurt about like a role I take or something, and I see he's blocked me. So, and then these guys will come and try to quote tweet me behind a block as well. So, I mean, if you're just a random person on Twitter, it's up to you. If it's on your experience, I mean, you could just easily mute them or not see their tweets. If you're not following them, you're not going to see their tweets. So, yeah, I wouldn't recommend it. That would be my advice. On his other question, he said, in the I Am 1776 dialogue on white identity you participated in, you noted that the Southern accent is in decline. In the South today, is it considered odd or low class to speak with a classic drawl? If a white man were to go into a bar in Nashville and order a drink with an accent like a Southern politician on the eve of Civil War speaking in favor of secession, would he attract some odd looks? No, he wouldn't. He wouldn't attract any odd looks. I'm just saying that among the southern suburbs, and more people are living in the suburbs than ever before, they don't speak in the type of drawl. And you can even see this among some of the rural people. Like there was that girl from Alabama who was making those videos and people were having a debate over, and her accent wasn't that thick. And there's other people who I've been seeing who came from like rural areas or pretty country areas and throughout the South, and they no longer have as strong of an accent. And I would say when it comes to the suburbs, it was seen as low class to do that. And if people had a drawl in the suburb I grew up in, people would make fun of them and they would try to ditch the drawl. The funny thing is they would then go to college, and in these fraternities, the drawl was admired and upheld. And these guys who never had a Southern accent prior to going to college would then go to college and then come back with a Southern accent, which was an affected Southern accent. I knew even guys in my fraternity who did that. So that's one weird thing. I don't know if that's the case today because, I'm several years out from college, so it may be a little bit different with Southern universities today. But that was the case back in the early 2010s and 2000s. But yeah, it's just that a lot of Southerners, even if they're in rural areas, and the media that they're consuming and the people they're interacting with on a day-to-day basis, they're not hearing this. It's not that that's the only accent that they're hearing. And the voices that they would emulate or try to affect is that they would try to lose that accent. I think if they were watching like a bunch of TV and watching TikToks and stuff, and no one has a Southern accent, and then they being consciously trying to imitate the voices that they hear. And so there's more dissemination of different type of culture that would push them into not having a Southern accent. But in terms of would you attract odd looks, well, it depends on how outrageous of an accent it is. It's like, if it's like Foghorn Leghorn, it's like, good sir, I would like a nice brandy with my as my beverage. If it's like something over the top, like, something that would have been caricatured in 1940s cartoon, yes, that would attract odd looks. But just the classic drawl, no. It wouldn't attract odd looks at all. Even the people at the bar would probably have some of an accent. Now, this is not from a Cognitive Elite member, but he did ask something in the comments, and I do want to talk a little bit about sports ball. So we didn't get to do that with the main one. So I will make one exception with this. It came from John. We have multiple Johns who ask questions. This is why. But he asked sports ball related questions. He was astounded to see so many NCAA March Madness games feature so many star white players. Tennessee, Creighton, Purdue, and UConn, to name a few. Even many black players are mixed with less magical behavior, of team first attitude, willingness to practice free throws, and the increased importance of the 3-point shot. Could a great replacement of blacks with A10 whites make college basketball Greer had pledged his favorite sport? And he also dreamt that that the 49ers had lost the Super Bowl with Trump as the QB, after which he retired. Is it time to blackpill? No, it's not time to blackpill. College basketball has always been pretty white, or much whiter than the NBA. For those things, most of the white players aren't going into the NBA. There's so many players in college basketball because there's so many schools. There's far more schools with basketball teams and football teams. And there's so few slots for the NBA. And also the NBA is recruiting from Eastern Europe, where a lot of these guys aren't playing college basketball. And a lot of the black players, I forget how long they have to stay in college now, because there was always arguments over whether they can draft them straight from high school. I know they can't draft them straight from high school anymore. I actually had to look this up. It's only 1 year. I couldn't remember if it's 2 years or 1 year. But so a lot of the best players, they're one and done. They go straight to the NBA, while the guys who wait till their senior year are not going to the NBA, and a lot of them end up being white. But the NBA is a lot whiter than when I was growing up. Because of the Eastern European influence, there's not as many white Americans in the NBA anymore. I don't follow it that closely. It's not my favorite sport to follow. I know there's not many guys like John Stockton anymore, who was a white American in the game, and Larry Bird, obviously. Most of the great white players are from overseas. But at least in college basketball, you see that. And yeah, I think it's probably a greater emphasis on team play. And those guys stick around to their senior year, while the really good black stars are only there for 1 or 2 years, and then they're off to the NBA. So that's probably a reason why. I don't know if that's going to be, but college basketball has always been significantly wider than the NBA. I don't know if it's wider now than, say, 20 years ago. There were some really all-white teams. I think it was Wisconsin or Indiana. It's one of these Big Ten teams that was 10 years ago or something, but one that went far. I think it went to the title game. And people complained that all other starters were white, or at least 4 out of the 5 were white. So yeah, it's always been that case, but it is interesting to know. And I'm going to conclude with one more question. All the rest of the questions are going to be in the mailbag. I should have told most of the guys that if I was going to mailbag, if it was going in the mailbag, but this is the last question. It's from Appalachian. He asks, Scott, why do you think the intelligence community and DOD is so anti-Trump? I came from a military family government service, and my relatives were all pro-Trump except for an uncle who was an intel analyst. You can talk to a fighter pilot or Marine, and they would usually be a MAGA hat wearer, at least the ones I've met, while the guy giving the fighter pilot's orders is a never-Trumper. What gives? What changes this? Well, I think the intel guys and the higher-up bureaucrats see Trump as a threat to their position, is that they think that Trump is going to reduce American defense spending and reduce America's military defense around the world. And also they have a greater commitment to liberal principles and values than a lot of the combat guys in combat positions and other things. And so they're more inclined to be liberal than I think a lot of the, the grunts, so to speak. And that's just military-wide. It's not just intel guys. I mean, it's not like all vets and all guys in the military are anti-Trump, but it is significantly more anti-Republican and the leader of the Republicans than it would have been 20 years ago. And there's way more generals who are, going on TV to talk about how awesome Biden is. And that's because they view Trump as not 100% down with the DOD's agenda. And the DOD's agenda is like extremely anti-Russia, pro-foreign interventions everywhere, more defense spending, pro-NATO, all these commitments. And Trump challenges these commitments. He challenges the status quo. And now a lot of these guys view liberals as more pro-status quo and upholding their interests. So they're more inclined to be liberal and Democrat and anti-Trump for those reasons. And they really didn't. They really got bothered by the Russia connections, which were entirely made up, and the positive connotations around Russia, because all these guys who are really into the IC and at the higher levels of the military see Russia as a great threat to America. We have to be 100% anti-Russia. And they view him as weak on the matter, while they know that every Democrat is 100% anti-Russia. So a lot of them are just more never Trump type Republicans, and you can always see that with Bill Kristol and them when they're trying to recruit people to give their position. These guys are all like, I'm a veteran and I'm tired of Trump not being pro-Ukraine. And that's another reason why a lot of these guys think that Ukraine needs as much defense spending as possible, as much spending and much aid as possible. So that's worth exploring in full, is like the development of the military, the U.S. military, and its political attitudes over time. I would like to read more on that. I've read a lot, but nothing specifically on the subject, and it'd be worthwhile to investigate this further, because it is a major development and it is important to our country, and it's something that reflects even Trump's ability to do things domestically. Like the military resisted his call to use them against the BLM rioters, and also the military seemed poised to overthrow him during January 6th, which is something the Democrats thought that the military would support Trump. But if the military had actually been there, they may have arrested Trump or done something like crazy like that. So that's just something to keep in mind. Anyway, that is it for today's Highly Respected. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. We've got a lot of great content coming this week. We're trying to get a new weekly schedule that's going to have even more highly respected content. So generally the schedule I'm trying to follow is the Monday is a highly respected episode. Tuesday is a column. Wednesday's mailbag. Thursday is another column. And then Friday is IQ supplements. We're probably not going to follow this for every week, but I'm going to try to follow it for most weeks. So we're going to have new content, highly respected content every day, or try to achieve that. So hopefully you guys are ready for an exciting 2024 where we're really going to be boosting everyone's IQ. So until next time, stay respected.